Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. We had a little music intro tonight for the first time. So for those who don't know me, I'm Chris Benner. I'm the director of the Institute for Social Transformation. I'm also a professor of environmental studies and sociology here at Santa Cruz. And I've been moderating this election series, University Forum set of lectures. This is part of the University Forum. It's an ongoing series that is focused on the relevance of research at UC Santa Cruz to the broader world. And this election series is co-sponsored by the Institute for Social Transformation here at UC Santa Cruz, whose mission is also to help support innovative scholarship that changes the world. There are many, many people who help make this series possible, and I want to acknowledge and thank them. It wouldn't be possible without them. I won't name them all because that would take most of the time. I want to jump into our conversation tonight. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. A few details about the event tonight. We're using this webinar tool, so there's no chat function, but we really want to engage with you. And the way to do that is in the Q&A function at the bottom. So please put your questions in there. I expect tonight's conversation to be really vibrant because we already have one question in there that we're getting ready to start. So please send more. We'll come to them later tonight. And tonight's event will also be recorded. So for those who come to previous events in this series, you know that the overall theme of this series is really trying to think beyond the specific choices in the election. The specific choices are incredibly important this election, both in candidates and propositions in California, but we want to try and understand where they fit in broader processes of social change, demographic changes, social movements, political institutions, et cetera, because this is really a pretty unprecedented moment in a whole variety of different ways that I'm sure we're more than familiar with as we're surrounded by news about the elections. The title of this series has been Elections, What They Are Good For, or What Are They Good For? To really highlight that elections are good for many important things. And if you have not registered to vote yet, I want to remind you that tonight is the last chance to register to vote before same-day registration on election day, which you can also do in a provisional matter. But it's much easier to just register tonight and vote. Registertovote.ca.gov. Someone will put that in the chat for you, that link on. Tonight's session is focused on the criminal justice system in the United States and really thinking about what's at stake in this election around the criminal justice system and what are the political possibilities of this moment. And we'll start nationally, but then focus in on California. And there's a number of important propositions on the ballot in California that I know many people are probably wondering about, and we hope to get to that at the end tonight. We have an incredible panel of people joining us tonight that I'm very happy to be with. I encourage you to go to our website and look at their bios in detail, and I'll put that in the chat as well. But I will briefly introduce them here. We have Anjali Verma, who's an assistant professor in the politics department. She has a PhD in criminology, law, and society from UC Irvine, another UC campus. And her research is broadly focused on questions about punishment in society and how that relates to inequality and some of the interplay between legal reform and politics. But she also has practical experience working as a policy advocate and communication strategist for the ACLU. Craig Haney is a professor of psychology at UC Santa Cruz, probably almost needs no introduction to most of us on this call. He's really noted for his work on the study of capital punishment and the psychological impact of imprisonment and prison isolation. I've been working on these issues for a number of decades, actually, and really a world leader on these issues. And then we also joined tonight by Erin Haney, who's currently the policy director at the Reform Alliance, a national organization with the mission of reducing our incarcerated population. One of the co-founders of that is Van Jones, who's the current CEO, who people may know. But Erin has a long history as an attorney protecting the rights of Indigenous clients at all levels of our broken justice system, including working in the public defender's office in both Santa Cruz and San Francisco, and has a BA degree from UC Santa Cruz as well as a law degree from UC Davis. And I will turn to them in just a moment, but to really preface this conversation, I just want to put on the table some of the are a few indicators of what's really, I think, a shocking reality in our country of how deep and extensive our criminal justice system is. So we're just all on the same table of understanding the conditions that we are in, but as we get into a discussion of what the implications are in the election and how we got here. So we have roughly 4% of the world's population and 19% of the world's prison population. Over 2 million people who are actually in prison. It's the highest incarceration rate in the world, about 639 per 100,000 adults. It's higher than North Korea, higher than Russia, higher than Cuba. It's the highest in the world. And of course, there's racial elements to that. For Black Americans, the incarceration rate is about 2.5 times at the moment the average across the whole population. It used to be higher than that. But again, that's just the tip of the iceberg, because those are the people who are in prison. When you count all the people that are in the broader criminal justice system, including those on parole, 6.6 million people, something like that. And we spend a tremendous amount on that overall criminal justice system. In California alone, when you look at what we spend at city, county, and state on policing, incarceration, and the criminal justice overall, it's about $50 billion just in California. It's about 3 times what we spend on higher education. And it comes out just in the prison population side about $65,000 per year per prisoner in California. So that's the reality we've inherited at this moment in our history in this election. And Aaron, I want to start with you sort of thinking about the national context. What do you think of as being most importantly at stake in this election as it relates to our systems of policing and incarceration?
I think it's hard to overstate how important this election is and how much is at stake. I think it's everything from very literally, life and death. If we look at the executions that this administration has carried out over the past several months, we went years without federal executions, and we've now had 7 in 2020. We have another one, the first woman to be executed in nearly 70 years. They've now scheduled a date for her on December 8th. So very literally, when we think about crime and punishment, this election matters in terms of who lives and dies in our system. I think in addition to that, you talked about the 2.3 million people behind bars and the 4.6 million people under community supervision. So under some form of correctional control. And really, the administration, while it doesn't necessarily control all of the policies, right? A lot of these people are in state facilities. They really do set the tone. They set the message for how we should be treating people. And so when you have an administration that preaches law and order, that tells us that more punishment is the only way to get to more justice, states tend to follow. And so really this election is, again, it's very literally about things like life and death and our federal prison population and our federal laws, but it's also very much about sort of how we as a nation think about crime and punishment, how we think about justice, and how we're going to set the tone in the years to come.
So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more. The record of the Trump administration is pretty clear on this. The record of Biden and Kamala Harris is perhaps a little more mixed, and you have, I think, have a particularly interesting perspective on that. How would you describe both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's record and perspective on our criminal justice system?
Sure. So I think, to be fair, I think one of the things that's really interesting about the criminal justice as an issue, when you look at it over time, and I know you already introduced me, but I do just want to say, my dad, I'm Aaron Haney, my dad is Craig Haney, and that's how we have the same last name. And so, I grew up just really learning everything from him and really watching his work and idolizing him. And so much of what I got to see growing up, I think at a very early age, was how the system was transforming, or oftentimes, sadly, how it was failing to transform, how it was stuck in the same patterns, in the same sort of regressive policies. And so I think when we look at any leader, right, who has been in elected office for some time, especially leaders who were law enforcement, whether that's district attorney or some sort of more traditional law enforcement like a police officer, we're going to see hopefully their views evolving over time. So when I was a public defender in San Francisco, Kamala Harris was in the district attorney's office in San Francisco. And I think that it's fair to say that the views that she had then were progressive for the time, but they were nowhere near what we would consider as progressive today, right? And so I think that what we see when we think about Kamala Harris is we see someone who has actually evolved in terms of her thinking about criminal justice. So I think it's fair to say she was always progressive for her position, especially as an elected Black woman in San Francisco. She set up one of the first sort of diversion programs in San Francisco, getting out and staying out there. And then from there, she became Attorney General, and she did grapple with some issues with the death penalty. So when she was an Attorney General, I was working at a place called Habeas Corpus Resource Center. So she was our opposition on every case. So for the last several years, she has been literally across the aisle from me on most cases, or at least her name has been on those pleadings. I will say, however, though, that as Attorney General, unlike this administration, she did not actually preside over any executions. And there are a number of reasons for that, but I do think it's important to note that. I also think it's incredibly important to note that she has talked about her record. She's been reflective about what she's done in the past. And I think that both her and Vice President Joe Biden have put forward some ideas about where criminal justice should go from here. I think when we think about Vice President Joe Biden, similarly, we have, an interesting history, right? He is partly responsible for the 1994 crime bill. That's something that he talked about with pride. But he also was a public defender at a time when being a public defender with a law degree often meant that you were not going to be able to go farther in elected office. It's something that we still see used against people. And I think similar to Kamala Harris, when we look at Joe Biden's record and sort of what he's come to today and the policies he's advancing, they both talk a lot about redemption, a lot about compassion, a lot about second chances and human dignity. And so I think it's really important to contrast sort of where they are now and the policies they're putting forth with what the administration is putting forth and what they're advocating for as a future for criminal justice.
So Anjali, I'd like to bring your perspective in here because of course the other thing that is shaping things so profoundly nationally at the moment is the whole movement for racial justice and sort of the revitalized protests that have emerged in nearly every major city around the country. And one of the demands is to really think about defunding the police or even abolishing the police. What's your sense of that movement and what that means in the context of this election?
Yeah, well, I think Aaron put it really well that on some level, well, on a very literal level, what's at stake in this election, both nationally, but also here in the state of California, are matters of life and death. But, I think that the current moment of where in our popular national, even mainstream discourse, we're talking about abolition and what that means. We're talking about what it would mean to abolish the police. What is it to defund the police? And I think that, the other thing that's at stake that people are bringing to the decisions that they're going to be making in this election is how they define what safety looks like for them and security, which has so many levels to it. It's not just public safety in the sort of typical way that we've figured it in American politics, which is a police notion of public safety, a notion that we need the state and we need the police to ensure public safety. The truth is that, the defund movement is forcing us to look at the choices that have been made and the zero-sum nature in many ways of what we've been funding. And I think, we've been funding this police notion of safety to the expense of having safety from a health perspective, of having economic safety. I mean, the sort of basic precarity of Americans' existence right now and their vulnerability and our fragility as a system and democracy, I think is sobering, right? And I think what's frustrating to many of us who have been doing this work for a long time, and certainly people of color in this country, is that none of that is a current event, sort of hot topic, like new development. And it's really hard, right, to be living in that precarious zone and having no one see or hear or care. And then you've got this flood of attention. And so I think that, you know, there's a lot of the sort of call out politics side to this too. I think that the left is really having to do a lot of self-examination at a time when the nature of electoral politics demands that there be solidarity along party lines. And I think that Americans are really questioning sort of the basic balance of the sort of direct democracy that we pride ourselves on, and the federalist ideal of having local governing, you know, local communities deciding for themselves how to govern themselves, as against you know, the need to have a strong federal government that actually enforces the law and regulates excesses of power and greed. So this election couldn't be any more existential. And that's why everyone should vote if they can, for sure.
And the place to register, if you haven't, registertovote.ca.gov. Craig, I want to bring your voice in here because, you know, part of what Anjali is saying is that, you know, it gives us a chance with this movement around defund the police to really get into our space of radical imagination and to try and really imagine a society where we have a different sense of safety and security. And my understanding is that in some of the courses you teach, you ask your students as one of the introductory exercises to begin to think about and imagine a different society in which we don't need and have the criminal justice system that we have in this country. And I wonder if you can just talk from your perspective, what are the political possibilities in this moment on a national scale to reframe the debate in the future around our criminal justice system?
Well, I agree with everything that's been said so far. The stakes in this election could not be higher. I also think, you know, there is another way, and I hope it's not a Pollyannish way to look at it. The possibility that this election gives us could not be greater. With the exception of the national national presidential election, the country has been moving in a very progressive direction on many, many fronts with respect to criminal justice reform. In our own state, there are many, many examples of this, and even in other really unlikely places. Even in the South, there have been many progressive political movements that have pushed the criminal justice system towards a more progressive response. Not necessarily all the way to defund the police, but at least to the point where we can entertain that possibility. And those demonstrations are taking place in cities all across the country. And they're diverse demonstrations. So there is a cross-sectional support for the progressive reform of the criminal justice system that hasn't been this strong, that hasn't been this well organized for 40 years. We have been in a kind of a regressive trend for 30 or so years, and then gradually for the last decade or so coming out of it. But we're really at a point now where the possibility, I think, is unlike anything we've seen, certainly in my professional lifetime. So that's the positive spin on all of it. And of course, there is much to be gained and much to be lost. We are beginning for the first time to talk about things that we've never talked about before. not just reducing the number of people who are in prison, which is incredibly important. And we've got some proposition talk that we'll get into later, I'm sure, about exactly that issue. But we're beginning to talk about issues like defunding the police, but not just defunding the police. Everybody really means by that, what do we do instead?
Right.
How do we look at other ways of, as Anjali puts it, creating public safety, which does not involve the criminal justice system? There is a way to create a safe and sustaining society that addresses the needs of all of its members, that does not involve a heavy-handed law enforcement presence for solving social problems. And that's on the ballot in many different places around the country as well, including in California. So, you know, we've got criminal justice issues on our plate tonight. We've also got an important affirmative action issue on our plate tonight, which is part of creating a sustaining, caring society for all of its members. So if you're concerned about racial justice, you need to be concerned about economic justice. Both of those things are intertwined with defunding the police efforts. So again, to go back to my colleagues' observations, this could not be a more important election. Much could be lost, but much also could be gained.
Well, I want to lift up something that you just said, Craig, and we'll move to California in just a minute. But the fact that there have been major achievements in other states, particularly in the South, highlights the fact that there has been bipartisan support on some level for criminal justice reform. And I wonder, you know, Aaron, if you or Craig, you could just talk a little bit more about that bipartisan support and how do we prevent the intense partisanship of this election from undermining the real potential for building on that bipartisan support for reform.
Well, I'm going to defer to Aaron on this, but I'm just going to tell you that about 2 or 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago by now, I attended an event in Washington, D.C. that actually Aaron's brother, my son, helped to create, that Van Jones was very much part of. And I went, and it was called a bipartisan summit on criminal justice reform. And I went, even though my children were involved in setting it up, very skeptical. because even a few years ago, bipartisan support for criminal justice reform seemed to me like a remote proposition. And I remember sitting in the audience before the panels began and looking up on the stage and watching Senator Cory Booker and former Congressman, Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, reaching kumbaya moment after moment after moment on criminal justice reform. And that was the first point I realized that there was actually a real possibility for this to take place. Constituencies that had once been at odds on these issues were now beginning to see a different direction. And you know, some constituencies seeing the wrong direction that they had pursued, and others seeing the possibility for moving things forward that they had been working on for many years. And into that space stepped Erin and her colleagues, and they have been doing incredible work since that point. And I'm going to let her talk about some of the ways she's achieved extraordinary progress with bipartisan support.
So, you know, I think as my dad was just saying, really a couple of years ago, there was this sort of meeting of the minds from the right and the left, and Cut 50, which was formed by Van Jones, Jessica Jackson, and my brother Matt Haney, really stepped up as one of, you know, not the first, but one of the first major bipartisan criminal justice reform organizations. I think up until that point, we had often seen, you know, criminal justice reforms that were loudly and proudly either very progressive and on the left, or conservative and on the right, organizations like Right on Crime. And so this was one of the first times where the mission of the organization itself was to be bipartisan. And so I think they built an incredible framework that many, many organizations are a huge part of. And I think most importantly, that has really been led by people who are directly impacted themselves. So this movement has been led and will continue to be led by people who themselves have been directly impacted, who have been behind bars, who are behind bars, or who have family members who have suffered behind bars. And so I think when this administration came into power, there was a real question of whether and how that was going to continue. And not just because it's hard enough to keep a bipartisan coalition together, but it gets extremely difficult when you throw in a lot of fiery rhetoric about law and order, and you know, it just becomes inherently polarized. And I think even despite that, right, we were able to, again, led by people who were themselves impacted by this issue, they were able to pass the First Step Act under this administration. And we can debate whether that was, you know, I know there are people that feel very strongly that that didn't go far enough. I think most of us who are involved would agree, which is why it was called the First Step Act.
Can you describe briefly what that act did, just for everyone?
Sure. Absolutely. So the First Step Act was a major prison and sentencing reform. It was one of the first major federal criminal justice reforms in decades. And essentially it did a number of things. So it reformed some of the really old and barbaric laws that were especially disparate in terms of race. So for example, the crack cocaine ratio, right? When we fixed that with the Fair Sentencing Act in this country, we didn't make it retroactive. So it meant that there were still people behind bars in the federal system, even though we had said as a country that this was unjust and needed to be changed, and had in fact changed it, we had not then gone back and made it right for the people who were behind bars. So it fixed that. It had a lot of provisions around dignity for incarcerated women. Those were led by a woman named Topeka Sam, who was incarcerated herself. And so I think a lot of people weren't aware that women are shackled when they're pregnant. They are shackled when they give birth. And there are just horrific stories, I mean, I think as we can all imagine, about how scarring that is literally, physically, and emotionally. And so the First Step Act fixed that. And then it did a number of things around reentry and credits to ensure that people who were working on getting rehabilitation, working on programming, would be able to get credits to get out and be prepared to come back into the community. So it's really an important blueprint. And it's something that thankfully a lot of states have picked up and really run with. So as my dad was mentioning, there have been a number of states in the South that have made great advances in criminal justice. But I think the key really has been, and this is something that Anjali was saying, it has been about where we sort of place the focus and the messaging, right? It's about how we think about what justice is, right? And for decades, we really have conflated justice and punishment as if they're one and the same. And so I think this is very much, most of these reforms are very much about disentangling those two things, right? Justice and punishment can be two different things. And so when you really focus the message on sort of what is justice, what makes a community better, what makes a community safer, those are things that we hear conservatives talk a lot about, right? Proudly, and as they should, right? Communities need to be safer. We hear a lot about family values. Those are all actually things that the criminal justice reform movement also embraces, right? So when we talk about parents being ripped away from their children to be incarcerated, that's a wrong that hurts us, at our core on the left and on the right. And so I think that has been a major part of really keeping that bipartisan coalition together, is focusing on what we can all agree on. And sadly, there are so many evils in this system that there's more than enough that we can come together on.
Well, what I'd love to do now is to transition a little bit to talk more specifically about California. And Craig, I wonder if I could turn to you to help us sort of understand how we got to the point we are in California, both sort of the rise of the prison construction and incarceration, and sort of the reforms that we've seen a little more recently. What would you point to as important milestones in that history?
Sure. Well, you know, the propositions that we're going to talk about tonight are criminal justice reform propositions. And as I said earlier, I would include the affirmative action proposition is very much related to it, which I know we're going to get to. But we're talking about continuing a process of reform, or in one instance, in terms of one of the propositions, perhaps turning back in the other direction. Let me start and very briefly summarize, you know, my own experience with this state. When I began to do this work many years ago, decades ago, really, California, at the time I was coming out of graduate school and beginning as an assistant professor at UC Santa Cruz, was still very much regarded as a leader in corrections and in criminal justice across the United States. Things were beginning to change, but they were changing very slowly. In the 1960s, California was seen as a more or less progressive prison system, having a more or less progressive criminal justice system. The California Supreme Court was the first in the country to declare the death penalty unconstitutional. And the legislature was very much on board with many of those views. But things began to change in California and in the country in the 1970s. There was the Nixon administration learned how to turn the protests, the civil rights protests of the late 1960s and early 1970s into a criminal justice matter rather than a civil rights matter, sometimes referred to as a Southern strategy. They were able to demonize civil rights protesters as street criminals, and began to create a law and order narrative around the country. Eventually, that began to take root in California as well. California was actually a little late to come to this, but when we came to it in the late 1970s and early 1980s, we came to it with a vengeance. And the California Department of Corrections began to expand exponentially. There was a proposition in 1982, the Crime Victims' Bill of Rights. Inaptly named, frankly, it did relatively little for crime victims, but it did a whole lot to expand the punitive reach of the criminal justice system in California, and began to spur increases in the population of the California prison system. And that increased almost unabated throughout the 1980s and 1990s. California prison system became hopelessly, dangerously overcrowded. There was a period of time in the late 1990s and early 2000s when the system held almost 200% of its capacity, twice as many people as the system was designed to accommodate. That meant that people were sleeping in hallways, they were sleeping in gymnasiums, they were sleeping on the floor of day rooms. And all of that was done with legislative and sometimes voter authorization, increasing laws, enhancing punishments, increasing the amount of prison time that people spent incarcerated for various crimes. The rollback began in the early 2000s. It began actually in 2000. There was a proposition in 2000 in which the citizens of California said, we're going to treat certain kinds of drug crimes as deserving treatment rather than punishment. That was a breakthrough in California. Nothing like that had ever been approved by the voters up until that point in time. And then there were several other propositions later on in the decade of 2012, 2014, 2016, in which we rolled back what had been the most draconian three strikes law in the country. We began to treat certain felonies as low-level felonies as misdemeanors instead of felonies, so that the time incarcerated could be served in the community in jails rather than prisons. The California prison system began to rapidly depopulate, so we went from a high of about 180,000 in prison now down to about 110. And the attitude and the mood of politicians in the state, and I think it is fair to say among the voters as well, changed considerably. In 2016, we passed Proposition 57, which changed the way we handled parole in California, which made it possible for people who had been sentenced with enhancements in the prison system to get reductions from the Board of Parole hearings if they qualified and if the Board of Parole hearings agreed that they should be released after they had served their full sentence for the core crime, instead of staying in throughout the entire lengthy period of the enhancements. And again, the prison system continued to decrease, along with a changed narrative in the rest of the country, that we had gone too far in the 80s and 90s, that punishment was not the answer, that we needed to create, as we were talking about earlier, a fair and just society that didn't depend exclusively on criminal justice punitive solutions. And that's where we find ourselves now. Do we continue this? Do we continue the process of reform, recognizing that there are other ways to create, as Anjali said earlier, public safety that does not involve punishment? Or do we once again begin to rely on a prison system which has proven to be extraordinarily limited, if not counterproductive, in terms of what it can do to create genuine public safety?
So Anjali, I want to bring some of your research in here to help trace one piece of that history that I think is important, which has to do with the effort to depopulate the prison population by moving people to local jails. And I know that's been some of your research. So if you can just talk a little bit more about, what that process has been like and what that experience has been for people incarcerated in local jails rather than the state prison system, and how we should interpret that shift.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I've really arrived at in my research is that we talk a lot about punitive ideology and sort of, conservative versus liberal. When it comes to crime politics, and particularly here in California, what it means to be conservative versus progressive it doesn't break along like the same lines as supporting a more abolitionist-oriented criminal justice system versus a more punitive one. And I think one of the things that has really explained the rise of mass incarceration in this country, but also in this state, is structural as much as it is ideological. The way that the state of California got to a point where we were housing twice as many people as there was square footage available in our prisons is because of what criminologists have called the correctional free lunch at the county level. And this is a structure of American criminal justice that's true in every state, which is that the vast majority of people who ever have contact with the criminal justice system have contact with a municipal police officer. They're arrested. They're then processed in a county court here in California. We call those superior courts. And the whole decision-making apparatus about, what kind of sentence, what kind of plea deal, how harsh to prosecute this person is made at the county level among actors that don't have to pay any of those costs for how much it costs to incarcerate someone for, as long as 25 years or life. So, you couldn't build a sort of economic model that was more predisposed to wanton waste and excesses, because at the local political level you can think that there's only upside to being really harsh and sending someone up to state prison. There are so many kind of political liabilities of what if you don't send them up to prison, what if they reoffend, and so I think that county free lunch piece is something that states across America are going to need to really, that would be a radical transformative shift that doesn't depend on a sort of ideological stance, but just basic economic and sort of governing common sense. Now, I think that the other thing that I've really learned is that because of this incredibly consequential county free lunch, here's where this theme of American federalism comes in again, but now at a kind of fractal level, where it's not just that, different states in this country have sort of different political cultures and different approaches to criminal justice, it's also the counties. So right here in our state, I think that, you know, people who live in California, and particularly people of color who live in California, understand that it's one thing to, you know, get pulled over in Santa Cruz County, and an entirely other thing to get pulled over in Bakersfield down in Kern County or in Fresno. And so, you know, there's just been remarkable variation in how punitive different counties in our state have been. And, you know, that also tracks some of the sort of the historical voting trends that, you know, on every single one of those propositions that Professor Haney encyclopedically gave us the historical sweep of. I mean, you can go and look at, you know, the handful of counties that have actually been driving that punitive human warehousing, human disposability, racist system. And I think what's important to remember is that that actually doesn't represent Californians, like from a just quantitative standpoint, right? It's outsized influence. And so, you know, in a sense, the direct democracy that we have here refracts a kind of perverted view of what it is that's actually coming from the people. What is the grassroots sort of demand? And this goes all the way back to, you know, your reference of Nixon and the Southern strategy back in 1968. I mean, it's very clear because all of the presidential files have now been declassified as of, I think, 4 years ago, that, you know, there was a production of moral panic. It had to be produced. I mean, that was not a governing problem where you have a kind of wicked policy issue and you have to figure out what to do about it. It was crime was a manufactured problem. And I think, you know, I think President Trump is taking, you know, that page right out of the playbook, but in ways that are not subtle and ultimately I don't think will be as effective.
So I want to remind you, those of you watching tonight, that we'll have a chance for your questions and answers very soon. I do want to transition a little bit to the propositions, and I think it kind of builds a little bit on what you were saying, Anjali, about sort of the county's role and where a lot of these decisions happen. So let's talk about Proposition 25. I think we'll start there because it's a particularly complicated one. And I wonder if you can start it. It's a referendum. Yes. On replacing cash bail with risk assessment. So yes. First, you know, what does it actually do? What's our decision in voting on that? And then we'll start with you, you know, should we vote for it or not? What are the implications of voting for it?
Yeah, well, so first let me just put on my like politics professor hat for a moment. And actually, like, I think it's worth just breaking down like what is a referendum and what does a yes versus a no mean. So like what is the decision that's being placed to voters? And so a referendum is an initiative brought by a voter or group of voters to essentially undo a previous law that was enacted through our legislative process. So back in 2018, the California legislature went through a long, deliberative, contentious process of arriving at Senate Bill 10, which removed the cash bail, money bail-based system. You know, when I try to explain sort of what SB 10 did, it's really hard for people to wrap their minds around removing cash bail because they literally can't think of a different bail system that could possibly exist. Everyone has the kind of idea of the grandmother who puts her house up as collateral, you know, so that like her grandson can get out to make bail. So, and people have watched Bounty Hunter. I mean, this whole cash bail system has been a financial racket and a huge corporate interest in this state and continues to be. And the fact that our legislature was able to pass SB 10, even though it wasn't perfect, says a lot about the kinds of power relations and shifts of who has power across these different contentious groups in California politics. And I would say like one causal factor in pushing that deeper fundamental displacement of the corporate interest group of bail bondsmen is that, you know, California there is an organization called Californians for Safety and Justice that is all about, it's completely crime victims, but crime victims who are mostly people of color, who come out and say, actually, no, we don't want the death penalty for this offender, even though, you know, they victimize us. And so they've really taken back the narrative of like who gets to make claims on behalf of crime victims. And because crime victim groups have been so powerful in California historically, I really think that this new organizing and social mobilization of actual crime victims that actually represent the vast majority of crime victims is what allowed the legislature to have the political wherewithal to end cash bail. So what you're voting on in Prop 25 is, should we uphold the legislature's law with SB 10? So a vote yes is to say, yes, we should uphold the legislature's law, which means we should continue to do away with cash bail. A vote no means that we revert back to this cash bail system. So here's where the dilemma comes in, and I can hold that if you want to.
Well, I was going to actually ask Aaron to talk a little bit about the dilemma, because I think there's many of us who can understand, the benefits of getting rid of a cash bail system because of all of the racist implications of that. So what does it replace it with, Aaron, and what are the issues around what it replaces it with?
Sure. So let me just say, because Anjali, I think you brought up such a good point. Californians for Safety and Justice is one of the most amazing groups out there. And so if you haven't heard of them, please look them up. They've been allies on pretty much every criminal justice reform, both in California, but also they have some national presence as well. And so they've been very, very important. And they are one of the prime sponsors of Yes on 25. And so I think it's incredibly important to look at their arguments in favor of it. I think the main argument against Prop 25 comes not around ending money bail, although I want to say I think we need to be very clear that the money going into No on 25 is from the bail bonds industry. It is from organizations and groups that want to keep cash money bail. So that is where that huge push is coming from, and nobody should mistake it as coming from anywhere else. There are, however, I think groups who are otherwise progressive and otherwise supportive of criminal justice reform, whose concern is that what we are replacing it with is essentially an algorithm, right? So the idea here is that we understand that cash money bail is terrible, that it is literally completely discriminates on the basis of money, right? You're incarcerated for the exact same charge. This is not about public safety. This is literally about money. If you have money, you can get out. And if you don't, you stay in. There's no calculation involving public safety, risk, flight, nothing. It's straight up about money. So everybody, for the most part, at least who supports criminal justice reform, agrees that that is bad. The idea here, though, is that what this would do is it would replace that sort of determination and what we call a bail schedule. So where they determine the amount somebody has to pay for their freedom. It would replace that with a sort of an equation, we'll say, right, with an algorithm. The algorithm looks at a number of different things, and this is where the problem occurs. I think a lot of the time, at least in the courtroom, we talk about when we think of tests, like we use it usually when we think of DUI tests, but garbage in, garbage out. So the problem with the algorithms is where they draw the data from. So for example, every algorithm that looks at risks, especially in the correctional setting, looks at number of arrests and police contacts. And of course, if you are a young person of color living in a certain zip code, you're going to have a lot more interactions with the police having nothing to do with your level of risk or with anything that you've done, but having completely to do with the profiling that occurs in those neighborhoods. So that has sort of been, I think, the dilemma. And so there are, I think it's also important to think about it statewide, right? There are some counties like San Francisco, where we have a very progressive district attorney, Chesa Boudin, who himself is doing some really important and interesting reforms around bail, right? And so some of the opposition, I think, that we've seen, you know, to this idea with Prop 25 is around the fact that there are some counties that feel like they can maybe do something else besides this algorithm. But I will say the data on Prop 25, as much as this dilemma exists, does suggest that Prop 25, that passing it, would in fact save over 140,000 people from being incarcerated pre-trial. And so while they're all passing back to you, I just want to say that, you know, while there are these issues, I think that we don't want to underestimate the message that it sends to say we are ending bail, and this is not a perfect solution, but we care about the 140,000 people, and we are going to continue to fix this algorithm and this process until it's right, because we know it will have problems.
Well, I actually want to go a little bit more in depth into that, because that was the very first question that came in from Willow, who was asking, if Prop 25 passes, how will we be able to eliminate or improve those algorithms or the problems associated with those algorithms? What are the next steps?
Sure. So I can just start and then I'll hand it over. But I will say, so groups like CSJ and ARC, which is the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, they worked very hard to make sure that language exists in Prop 25 to consistently collect data on the algorithms and to check specifically for racially disparate impact, right? So what they are going to do, which is very unusual, you know, usually when you have a policy that sets up something like an algorithm or a tool, they say this is going to be the tool and they leave it as is. With Prop 25, it's doing something very different, which is saying this is the tool that we have, but it needs to be refined, it needs to be checked, and it needs to be recalibrated, right? And so in Prop 25, we are going to be gathering data. If it passes, right, we will be gathering data and they will be checking it. And according to what those sort of disparate impact data that they collect, they'll be able to recalibrate based on that.
That's great.
And I just wanted to jump in and say that, you know, I'm actually of the view, sort of just based on sort of my training in criminology, where, you know, a lot of what criminologists do is try to perfect models that can predict recidivism or predict crime, predict risk. And I'm of the view that that is a failed endeavor, like through and through. So the idea of improving an algorithm is an oxymoron to me. And if what you're concerned about is, you know, sort of the reproduction of race and economic inequalities, because in addition to, you know, some of the questions that Aaron rightly flagged get asked, right? Like, what is your criminal history, et cetera? There are all of these questions that have to do with need, not risk, such as, do you have a job? Do you have a place to live? Do you have a mental illness? Do you have a drug addiction? I mean, and so, and based on sort of whether or not you can answer those questions properly, I mean, all of that is prefigured by the radical inequality that our criminal justice system has already wrought. And so we're caught in a tautological loop. I mean, like quite literally, you know, with the algorithms, but, you know, the important thing is the transparency that removing cash bail and a connected piece of Senate Bill 36, which kind of specifies a lot of things about this risk assessment that will come in place. But the key thing is, I mean, for us to even be talking about collecting data and making transparent like the county variations across what counties are doing is itself a kind of radical transformation. And I don't want people to lose sight of the shift in power relations once again, and the ability to do politics in the criminal justice system, where before it was cloistered, really, I think, literally imprisoned from the sort of political sphere. And so despite this policy contention, that's why I voted yes on Prop 25, even though I am staunchly opposed to risk assessments.
So I want to bring in one other proposition here, and then we'll go more specifically to many of the other questions. And there were a couple about this one in particular, but I want to bring in Proposition 20, which I think is one of the other more confusing ones here: criminal sentencing, parole, and DNA collection initiative. Craig, is that something you can speak to?
Well, yes. I mean, that is it's a proposition that very clearly is an attempt to turn back the criminal justice reforms that the legislature, the governor, and indeed in the last 6 or 7 years, the voters in the form of propositions that they've endorsed, a path that they've put us on. So this is really an attempt to roll back, in particularly Proposition 57, which dealt mostly with eligibility for parole, but it also deals with the issue of which kinds of crimes can be considered misdemeanors versus felonies and so on. So it touches a little bit on 47 as well. And it really is an attempt to really pull back on those reforms. The objective analysis of it is that it will result in a significant increase in the number of people who are in prison. It will significantly increase the amount of money Californians spend on their prison system. And it's being done with no evidence that it is necessary. So the justification for this is we've gone too far in reforms, and yet there's no data to suggest that we have. These reforms that, as I said earlier, we've been engaged in over the last decade or so, have not produced any significant increase in the amount of crime in California. We've significantly, and I think appropriately, reduced the number of people in prison. We've begun in our prison system, now that it's not hopelessly overcrowded, to start thinking about issues of rehabilitation, which were impossible when the system was operating at 200% of capacity. And there's every reason to believe that we will begin to reap some benefits of this changed orientation of the prison system, operating under a more manageable population cap. I see no reason whatsoever to begin to reverse those trends now without any evidence whatsoever that it's necessary. It's a pushback from forces that really were opposed to those earlier reforms. They were opposed to those earlier propositions that were passed. And now I think this is an attempt for them to roll back something in elections that they lost, and I personally would vote against it.
Just to add to that, I mean, I think with every California proposition, any election year, but especially when it comes to criminal justice, there's what it's about on its face, and then there's the political economy beneath it, which may not be exactly what it seems, right? So, you know, Aaron talked really helpfully about Prop 25. This is not some grassroots proposition. This is coming from a corporate special interest group, despite the rhetoric around it. Now, I think, Craig, you're right that there is a sort of element of wanting to roll back some of the reclassifications of crimes that have allowed the California prison system to become less inhumanely overcrowded, though still overcrowded. But it's also about something else, which I think we need to realize is going on, is that what's at stake in the reclassification of these current misdemeanor crimes to now become felonies is not just the risk of more incarceration and more people on parole for longer periods of time, it's also DNA collection. And based on, you know, what I understand from people working on the ground and familiar with sort of like what's behind this, is it you know, it's going to wrap an entire population of people into having to give their DNA. And so I think that voters just need to be aware that they need to think about what is their stance on privacy? What is their stance on mass DNA collection? And as you know, if prison downsizing and some of the radical imagination that we've been able to garner in this moment like continues to have momentum, we're gonna have to look really carefully at all of these ways in which the carceral net gets wider, even if less people end up behind the bars of a prison or a jail.
Sorry, can I just add very, very quickly to Prop 20? I promise it'll be fast. I just want to point people today, you know, a lot of this tough on crime rhetoric that's come with California's propositions often comes from there's certain specific actors and messengers. They are often family members of crime victims. And one such very powerful and compelling messenger has been Polly Klaas's father. And so if you haven't seen it, Polly Klaas's sisters today came out with a piece asking folks to please vote no on Proposition 20, that they want everyone to know that they do not want their sister's legacy to be this tough on crime, that Prop 20 is not in fact even tough on crime, it's tough on rehabilitation, it's tough on compassion, it's tough on smart reforms. So I did just want to flag that for folks.
Thank you for that. The two other propositions that we talked about talking about, I think, are a lot simpler. One is Prop 17, restoring voting rights. Do you want to quickly say a couple words about that, Erin? Because I know that's been one of your areas of concern.
Absolutely. So we estimate that in the United States, there are over 5.2 million people who are currently disenfranchised due to felony voting restrictions. That's 5.2 million people who want to vote, who cannot vote because they have been convicted of a felony. Prop 17 in California gives people on parole the right to vote. This is incredibly important. It's something that we beg folks to do all the time as part of their civic engagement. It's also incredibly important for the reasons that we all just talked about. So much of what we vote on impacts people who have criminal records. And so the idea that we are not allowing them a say in what's happening is just unconscionable. And so this really gives us a chance to say your voice matters, your vote matters, and to really give people more civic engagement.
And then the other proposition you mentioned, Craig, earlier on, it's Proposition 16, which would really restore the ability to use affirmative action in all sorts of state decisions. So it's repealing Prop 209. Do you want to say anything more about that?
Well, I alluded to this earlier, and I do think that everybody who's listening who is very much in favor of racial justice and making the criminal justice system more fair has to understand the connection between economic justice and criminal justice. And affirmative action is part of economic justice for people of color. And, you know, we're 400 years away from slavery in this country and 150 years past the Civil War. And we are still fighting the battle of racial justice at economic levels. Affirmative action is a tool. It's a modest tool to help us achieve racial justice. And it is intimately related to criminal justice. You know, the Black Lives Matter movement that was in many ways spurred by the tragic death of George Floyd, it had been there before, but it catalyzed a larger movement. George Floyd's own life is a perfect example of the interconnectedness of these things. Long before Officer Chauvin put his knee on George Floyd's neck for 8.5 minutes, George Floyd had been crushed by economic injustice in the American society. He came from a family of sharecroppers. He moved with his parents to a housing project in Houston. He struggled in substandard schools to get an education, got in trouble in a criminal justice system that crushed him. He spent 10 months in jail for a $10 drug deal. And many other examples of an African-American man with a record, unable to get gainful employment, moved to Minnesota to try to recreate a life for himself, and was living on the margins of society, still trying to climb back in to the mainstream after all of that injustice that had been set on top of him before the criminal justice system took his life. As tragic as that story is, it's not uncommon. It's the normative story for people of color in this society. And unless and until we figure out ways to achieve economic justice for everyone, then criminal justice is just going to be an appendage of a system that is unjust in profound other ways.
Craig did what he does so effectively in his work, you know, in mitigating evidence in death penalty cases where, you know, I've heard him give these personal histories, right? And Craig will sometimes show a map of like how many times this person moved before they were the age of like 12, you know? And so I'm so glad, Craig, that you kind of reminded us that, like, you know, the problem is not just about police violence. I mean, it was really just in some ways, this like inevitable like conclusion to this like slow going, chronic, unstoppable racial capitalist oppression that, you know, that we have to deal with if we're going to make any kind of reform of policing, or even if we were to abolish the police. We can abolish the police and leave George Floyd and everything that happened in his life completely unsettled, right? So I'm really glad you said that. And I want to just say that, you know, also what's at stake with all this now is COVID. So when we talk about who's, you know, are we gonna put more people in prisons and jails or not? I mean, there's also this death sentence that's wrapped up in that, okay? So like every additional person that we choose to put behind bars is an epidemiological effect. And then the last thing I just wanted to say is that what this really makes me think about is, you know, especially we see this with Prop 17, but it's also true with Prop 16, is what's at stake in this election is citizenship. Citizenship. And when we say public safety, it's like who counts as the public, who deserves safety, which is another way of saying like who's part of our polity. Who is a citizen? And, you know, criminologically, we know that people who have the benefit of college education, here at the UC, we pride ourselves in being an engine of upward social and racial mobility, but that's also a reduction of criminal offending. So these things truly are ecologically connected.
I want to bring in a few more voices from our audience. These are two questions that are closely related, one from Randy and one from Ray, that are both about district attorneys. And it touches on something that you've all talked about of, you know, how different they are in different parts of this state. And Randy, you know, provides the contrast between sort of sheriffs that are tough on crime or law and order with Chesa Boudin, who you mentioned in San Francisco, who take a more approach about decriminalization. And Ray, you know, asked this question about so much of what district attorneys do is behind closed doors. So let's start with you, Aaron, about how can we help make this localized system of what district attorneys do in our criminal justice system more equitable and more accountable?
Sure. So, I mean, I think it's such an important question, and it's some of the issue with our system, right? It is true that your zip code often determines what type of punishment you get. And so if you have progressive district attorneys who understand that punishment and justice are not the same thing, who want to do, for example, again, like Chesa Boudin, who wants to do restorative justice, you're going to have access to a lot more different options. And it's also going to make communities safer. In terms terms of what we can do, there are a couple of things, right? There are some statewide standards that are important. So there are a number of laws that the California legislature just passed, for example, that directly impact what options district attorneys have. We have in lots of other states, for example, right now, New Jersey is really grappling with trying to repeal mandatory minimums. So there are a number of things that you can do statewide. There were several, I want to say about 5 or 6 bills actually that the legislature just passed in California that will impact the options. I would say the other thing is, you know, the district attorneys are local elected officials. They really do care about public pressure and about what their constituency has to say. They are vulnerable to that. They have to be elected. For example, in Los Angeles, there is a very heated district attorney race right now. There will in fact be a forum tomorrow night, I believe, with George Gascon, who is the former San Francisco district attorney who is now running in Los Angeles against Jackie Lacey. Show up to district attorney forums, ask questions about, you know, are they, for example, going to require racial impact statements with every single sentencing? You know, in San Francisco, CHESA instituted a policy where every single sentencing, the prosecutor has to say, what impact does this have in terms of race, in terms of class? You know, are they going to be looking at things like that? Are they going to agree not to, you know, go for the death penalty in certain cases? So really put that pressure on. Local elections is where it really actually matters, and you can make a huge difference.
So Heidi asks a question which relates to this local experience too, which is about AB 109, the bill that helped move people from prison to local jails. So would anyone really want to go in more depth is how has that worked out?
I can do that quickly. Just that's my sort of main area of research. And to be clear, so AB 109 was passed in 2011. It's known as Public Safety Realignment. So when you hear people talk about realignment, that's the legislation they're referring to. And what was actually quite remarkable about it is that it removed that correctional county free lunch that I talked about earlier, which was a radical dose of reform, especially for the highest feasting counties that were feasting on this like all you can eat buffet of free prison, basically, historically. But it also, to be clear, it didn't specify that this class of nonviolent offenders would no longer serve terms in prison, but instead in county jails. It actually gave county officials the discretion to choose from a range of different sanctioning that did not necessarily need to entail jail incarceration. And so here's where, Chris, your point about the kind of radical imagination, it's like this moment is calling for us to imagine outside of these like reactionary reforms. I mean, because of like just good old-fashioned community organizing in some counties, you know, constituents were going to the Board of Supervisors, were going to these community corrections partnership meetings, which are required to be publicly, you know, accessible to the public. And they were saying, hey, you explain to us why it is that the conversation is how do we build more jails, when maybe we should have a conversation about whether these people belong in a jail at all. And that was the abolitionist imagination at work with public safety realignment. So, you know, I think just the ability to put a dream on what might happen under realignment, which is to say that maybe this is how California will truly decarcerate and downsize its prisons. We had to first articulate that possibility was there, which requires a close reading of laws, and then just like dogged, embedded community organizing. And, you know, from my research on what explains why different counties had vastly different outcomes in terms of whether they actually decarcerated under realignment or not, the truth is that in counties where there was already an infrastructure of community organizing, networks of people who had worked together on other policy areas, not even criminal justice, but this is the sort of de Tocquevillian, point about like one thing that Americans can do when they want to do it and do it really well is form local associations and shape governmental policy. And we really see that with AB 109. So I don't think it's been an unmitigated success by any means, but it shifted power relations in ways that created openings to prove what was possible.
Right. So we have a couple of questions that are about judges, and I was going to direct this to you, Craig, I think, because one question from Bernard was, what has been the role of the California Supreme Court or US Supreme Court in criminal justice reform, and what recent cases have had a major impact on criminal justice reform? And connected to that is another question from Catherine, which is raising the question about the process of appointing judges, particularly in the federal justice system, where a concern of it being appointed, quote, by the rich in reality, in terms of sort of the elite nature of our elected officials. And does this influence the skewed prison system? So talk to us a little bit about a role of judges, and particularly the Supreme Court level.
Well, it's a tale of two cities with respect to the state and federal Supreme Court. The California Supreme Court has a mixed record in terms of criminal justice decisions, but it has become increasingly thoughtful, I think. Not terrific, but sometimes surprisingly fair. For a long period of time, during that period when the state and the legislature and the propositions were all moving us towards law and order, the Supreme Court in California was lockstep with them and supporting all of those laws in the 80s, from the last half of the 80s through the 90s until the early 2000s. It's been a mixed bag since then. It's a more thoughtful court and a more unpredictable court. And sometimes they do very progressive things and sometimes not so progressive. The United States Supreme Court has been, unfortunately, a little easier to characterize. They have not been helpful in terms of criminal justice reform at all. Really since Justice Kennedy opined in 2011 that the California Supreme Court was unconstitutionally overcrowded, which led to AB 109 and the depopulating of the California prison system. The United States Supreme Court has taken very conservative positions. And let me just quickly address this issue of Supreme Court appointments. So this is on everyone's mind in the last week or so. It's not just that the wealthy influence the appointments to the federal judiciary. There is a very tightly controlled ideological litmus test which is applied. The Federalist Society has an outsized influence over who gets appointed to the federal bench under the Republican Senate. If you have 18 minutes to spare this week, look up Senator Sheldon Whitehouse's questioning of Amy Coney Barrett in the Supreme Court hearings. And questioning should be put in quotes because Whitehouse realized that the nominee, Judge Barrett, was not really going to answer questions. So he used his 20 minutes to give a master class on political influence in the federal judiciary appointment process. It is well worth, you can look it up on YouTube. It is well worth your 18 minutes because it is a chilling insight into how dark money and ideological purity have influenced the appointment to the federal judiciary under the Trump administration in a way that is utterly and completely unprecedented and extraordinarily problematic going forward in terms of our ability to get justice from the federal court system.
Can I also just add that, I mean, something very cynical that, you know, I've learned about federal court intervention into state prison conditions, which is rare, as Craig has pointed out. But even when courts intervene and find a state prison system such as California's to be so extremely overcrowded as to violate the Eighth Amendment prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, what's really sad is that what's at stake for the court has really never been people's lives. And, you know, even if they use the rhetoric of human dignity, it's about power, and it's about the relationship between the federal government and the state. And what a court case like Brown v. Plata in 2011, which was like hailed as this historic victory, right? And certainly made a difference, is that the court is never going to tell a state how to remediate its prison overcrowding, for example. And that's why the history of mass incarceration in America is littered with court interventions that got sort of translated in the state political sphere to galvanize unprecedented spending to fund unprecedented building of prisons. And that's where that failure of imagination comes in, right? When a court says you need to reduce the percentage occupancy of an institution, that doesn't mean that we just have to go expand the denominator by building more beds. We need to start injecting these questions about, well, like maybe we shouldn't have as many people going into these systems.
And then just to add to that, I mean, that's the aftermath of that decision, Brown v. Plata in 2011, is part of what I think opened up this space for reimagining some of the options and alternatives we're talking about now. Absolutely. Because it came at a time when the state could have gone in the other direction. It could have gone in the direction that many other states would have, which is to build more prisons.
Right.
And it was a moment in the political history of this state when we decided not to do that. The legislature, the governor, and the citizens of California, frankly, were ready for another approach. And AB 109 was part of that, as Anjali says, not perfect by any means, but the possibility of doing things differently and better was there.
Yeah, and then Prop 47 in 2014, which is responsible for much of the decarceration that took place, which, you know, wouldn't have been possible but for the changes, again, in the power relations and the ecosystem, that having that federal court pressure to do something, and then having the county free lunch removed, all of a sudden, you've actually got a crisis in the system. And the crisis for us was like the human dignity and human rights crisis, but it became an actual governing and economic crisis. And that's what it took to decarcerate in this state.
Really helpful to hear that broader context and framing. That's great. I'm sort of hesitating here because there are a number of questions that bring us back to Prop 25, and I think it helps point to some of the challenges of this situation. And I'll just lift up, a couple of, Angelica is particularly articulate in several questions about highlighting some of the bias in the data that is driving these algorithms, and talking about data that's based on gang databases, racially profiling, sort of the history of, the broader social conditions that shape who ends up in our criminal justice system. And then saying, well, what happens when people who are profiled and end up arrested with no access to cash bail and probably end up agreeing to a plea bargain and, end up in that? And what does that mean for, their ongoing, capture in the state criminal justice system? And then Christine asked this question too, which is sort of related. What's the argument against risk assessment in determining whether or not to release prior to hearing? So, it's clearly, there's a number of other questions there too. This whole challenge of being caught in this dilemma of an imperfect solution. But I wonder if any of you want to talk a little bit more about the bias in the data and what the implications are about that as it relates to this proposition and really the broader movement to try and change our bail system.
Well, I have a lot to say about risk assessments, but I want to contribute a question that activists and community organizers posed to me that made me really kind of clarify how I ultimately decided to vote, which was to actually invert the dilemma, which is to say there are groups that have contributed lots of money to get this referendum on the ballot, who argue that the problem with ending cash bail is that now rich people will be subject to risk assessments. And so what the misspecification there is that, of course, well, rich people who are also going to be tracking as predominantly white and because risk assessments are going to be baking in all of these social inequity factors. No, if you're like a rich white person, you're probably going to do fine on that risk assessment. And so there's a constituency that wants to be able to buy their way out of jail, right? So it's just a little bit of a different way of thinking about what's at stake here, is like the privilege to just buy your way out. And the concern that those type of folks have of being subject to this like big state sort of, you know, overreach assessment is the kind of conservative libertarian critique as well. So the politics of this are really interesting.
Yeah, I'll just add very, very briefly. I shared the same concerns around risk assessments. I think that this was a very, very hard one for me. And, you know, if you had asked me last week, which some of the people on this call did, I may have come down in a different place. But what I will say, which I think is super important, is that the people who are in the courtrooms every single day, who are arguing for their clients to get out, the California Public Defenders Association has come out in favor of 25. And I think that that is very meaningful. So again, I have so much respect for the San Francisco Public Defender's Office, and I agree with their assessment as well, that for them, they do see the algorithms as determinative. But for me, if you look at the fact that the California Public Defenders Association, the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, Cut 50, Californians for Safety and Justice, these are all folks who are directly impacted by this system, and they are all coming forward to say that this is better than what we currently have. That while this will also need to be fixed, that this will make a real difference in real lives immediately, and that to me is very meaningful.
Can I just say, to sum this up, I think, and it is a difficult question, cash bail is irrational. It makes no sense to condition someone's continued confinement on whether or not they have enough money to get out. It's unfair for exactly the same reason. It privileges someone's economic wherewithal over anything else. And I think for those reasons, it's unsalvageable. Mm-hmm. Risk assessments are imperfect, but they can be improved. Cash bail cannot be improved except to be eliminated. One of the things we did this year, Assemblyman Ash Kalra across the hill in San Jose got a Racial Justice Act passed in California. So, and signed by the governor. So if racial factors played a role in anyone's case, they can reopen that case. And I'd like to see the Racial Justice Act applied to the use of algorithms in deciding on bail. It's a slight extension of Kalra's bill, but well within the ability of the legislature to do it. Those are the kinds of discussions we should be having, which we can't have as long as we have cash bail.
Craig, write that idea down, because that's genius.
So we have come to the end of our time. I want to thank all of you who came to this event to listen to this really vibrant conversation, and really thank all three of you for the work that you do most of all, and for taking the time out to share that with all of us, and your insights, tremendously valuable. I wanted to let people know some additional resources. If you want to learn more about the work of the Reform Alliance that Erin's doing and others, I've just put the link in there. We also have an incredible series on campus starting tomorrow, actually, about visualizing abolition. So if people are interested in extending this conversation to really thinking about abolition, the event tomorrow night is with Angela Davis and Gina Dent, starting at 4 tomorrow. So please do take a look at that. And if you have not registered to vote yet, you still have a few hours left to register now, and I put the link in there, registertovote.ca.gov. So Anjali, Craig, Aaron, thank you so much for all that you do, and thank you all for joining us. We'll call it there.